When Malcolm Vance arrived at his wife's promotion party, he expected a private apology, not a public execution. Before hundreds of executives, Simone mocked his worn suit, denied he belonged beside her, and ordered security to drag him through the ballroom doors. She never noticed the chairman rise from the head table. She never saw board members go pale or investors stop clapping. Outside, Malcolm straightened his jacket and prepared to leave the company he had secretly built. Then Chairman Everett Boone stormed into the lobby, faced the stunned guards, and said two words that destroyed Simone's victory, "My boss." Malcolm stood in front of the mirror in the house he and Simone had shared for 11 years, buttoning a charcoal suit that had been worn to dozens of quiet dinners, and never once to anything resembling tonight. The fabric was clean, and it still fit him well, but it carried none of the shine that would surround the hundreds of directors, investors, and city officials filling the ballroom of the Wellington Crown Hotel. On the dresser sat the invitation to his wife's promotion ceremony, and his name was nowhere on it. Simone had blamed her assistant for the omission, but when Malcolm asked if she actually wanted him there, she had only told him he could come if he knew how to avoid embarrassing her. He thought back to the early years, when Simone worked in a cramped office and was routinely overlooked by senior managers who barely learned her name, and he remembered the nights he stayed awake beside her, breaking down contracts and rehearsing pitches until she could deliver them without fear. She never knew how many of the strategies that carried her upward had been quietly shaped by his own decades of investment experience. In recent years, she had begun hiding the marriage altogether inside the walls of her company, no longer wearing her ring to industry events, posting photos of herself alone at resorts and conferences, as if the man beside her simply did not exist. When he asked her about it, she said, an image of independence made people take her seriously, and he chose not to argue still, hoping that success would eventually bring back the woman who once cried in a parking lot and told him that his belief in her was the only thing keeping her upright. He thought about the small dinners they used to share at a diner 3 blocks from their first apartment, back when Simone would sketch career plans on paper napkins, and Malcolm would quietly correct her math without ever taking credit for the fix. Those years had felt like partnership. These last few had felt increasingly like an audition. She was afraid he might fail in front of the wrong audience. Before he left the house that evening, a message arrived from Rochelle Whitaker, the company's general counsel, warning him that Preston Hale was preparing a vote immediately after the party and that Malcolm needed to be present. Malcolm replied that he intended to observe before doing anything at all, and Rochelle warned him that Simone might already have signed documents she did not fully understand. He glanced at a photograph on the shelf from their wedding day, in which Simone gripped his hand tightly, wearing no designer gown, holding no title, and carrying not a trace of shame. He decided to walk into that ballroom, not as the controlling shareholder of a company worth billions, but simply as a husband hoping to salvage what was left of his marriage. When he reached the hotel, the young woman at the check-in table scanned the guest list twice, glanced up at him with visible discomfort, and said she was sorry, but his wife had specifically requested that he not be allowed inside. The ballroom occupied the top floor of the hotel, an enormous space glowing beneath a screen displaying Simone's face beside the words, "The future of the company." Crystal chandeliers hung low over round tables dressed in white linen, and a string quartet played softly near the far wall, while servers moved between clusters of guests carrying trays of champagne that cost more per bottle than most of the hotel staff earned in a week. It was exactly the kind of room Simone had once said she dreamed of standing inside, back when dreams like that still felt harmless. Malcolm calmly asked the staff to check the list again, and when his name reached security, a broad-shouldered man named Curtis Langston appeared polite but immovable, explaining that he had received specific instructions from the event organizer. At that exact moment, Everett Boone, chairman of the board, spotted Malcolm through the open doors and immediately signaled for them to let him through, announcing that Malcolm was his personal guest. The staff exchanged confused glances as the most powerful man in the room walked forward to personally greet someone dressed like an ordinary consultant. Malcolm quietly asked Everett not to reveal anything about his identity that evening, saying he wanted to hear what Simone truly thought of him before making any decisions. And though Everett disagreed with the plan, he respected it. Inside, Simone stood beside Preston Hale and a cluster of major investors, and the moment she saw Malcolm, her practiced smile disappeared entirely. She pulled him aside and demanded to know why he had come, after she made it clear this night mattered more than anything else in her career. He held up the invitation and told her simply that he had come to celebrate his wife, but she studied his suit, glanced at the people watching from nearby tables, and instructed him to stand near the back of the room, avoid speaking to any board members, and never mention to anyone that they were married. When he asked whether she was genuinely ashamed of him, she avoided the question and insisted that tonight would determine her entire future, that he did not understand how power actually worked in rooms like this one. Meanwhile, Nadine Brooks, the head of internal audit, tried to approach Malcolm to warn him about irregular figures buried inside a merger file. But Preston noticed and ordered the staff to remove her from the guest area before she could say another word. Malcolm realized this celebration was never simply about a promotion. It was the opening act of a quiet takeover unfolding inside the company's own boardroom. Preston announced to the crowd that Simone would soon oversee a massive acquisition of an infrastructure company called Meridian Transit, valued at over $2.5 billion, calling it the largest transaction in the company's history and the deal that would define the next decade of growth. The room erupted in applause, and several investors immediately began asking Simone questions about timelines and returns, treating her as though the deal had already been finalized in every meaningful sense. Malcolm already knew from years of quiet due diligence that Meridian Transit was hiding a staggering amount of debt, and that if the deal went through, the company could lose hundreds of millions of dollars, while Preston collected a hidden commission for himself. Before Malcolm could say anything, the host called Simone up to the stage, and as she walked away, she leaned close to him and whispered that no one in this room could ever learn that he was her husband. Simone climbed onto the stage as applause rolled through the ballroom, and she began describing her journey from an overlooked junior employee to executive vice president, insisting that real success required cutting away relationships, habits, and people who held a person back. She spoke about sleepless nights, about proving herself in rooms that never expected a woman like her to succeed, and about the sacrifices that had brought her to this exact stage, and every word landed with the polish of a speech that had been rehearsed for weeks in front of a mirror. Malcolm listened and understood that her speech was not only about her career, she was using their marriage itself as the symbol of everything she claimed she needed to leave behind. When she finished, Preston raised his glass and called her a self-made leader, and a wealthy investor standing near the family section noticed Malcolm and asked what his connection to Simone actually was. Before Malcolm could answer, Simone rushed over and told the investor in front of hundreds of listening guests that Malcolm was simply an old acquaintance who had shown up uninvited. Malcolm looked directly at his wife and asked if she truly wanted to say that out loud, and the noise of the ballroom fell into an uncomfortable hush around them. Fearing that Malcolm might expose their marriage or create a scene that would ruin the most important night of her career, Simone raised her voice and accused him of trying to sabotage everything she had built. He reminded her that she was the one who had personally sent the invitation to their home, but she denied it, telling the crowd that he was simply attaching himself to her success. Preston pressed the moment further and instructed security to handle the intruder, and Curtis approached along with 2 other guards, while Malcolm offered no resistance, asking Simone one final time if she truly wanted her own husband thrown out in front of everyone she was trying to impress. Her answer came without hesitation. She said she did not know this man. She ordered Curtis to remove him from the hotel immediately, and as a guard gripped his arm, Malcolm caught sight of Everett rising sharply from the head table, but a small shake of his head told the chairman to wait. He wanted Simone to make this choice on her own, without the weight of his real position influencing what she did next. As he was led across the ballroom floor, laughter followed him from several directions, and some executives openly called him a failure, trying to ride the coattails of his successful wife, while phones were lifted to record the moment. Rochelle rose from her seat to follow him outside. But Preston blocked her path and warned that intervening would cost her a place on the board, and she simply told him that he had just threatened the wrong person on the wrong night. Malcolm was pushed through the ballroom doors into the hallway, and Simone turned back toward the stage, to forcing a smile as the music resumed, though none of the board members were clapping anymore. A waiter passing through the corridor slowed his cart just long enough to offer Malcolm a bottle of water, an unremarkable kindness that felt strangely large in a night otherwise stripped of any warmth. Out in the corridor, Malcolm slid the wedding ring from his finger, but did not discard it, holding it quietly in his closed hand, understanding now that Simone had not acted in a moment of panic. She had been preparing for this exact moment for a very long time, rehearsing the version of herself that could stand on a stage and disown the man who once believed in her before anyone else did. Everett came storming out of the ballroom moments later, walking straight toward the security team and speaking loudly enough for every guest near the doors to hear him. "Take your hands off him," he said. "That man is my boss." Curtis and the other guards released Malcolm, instantly certain they had somehow misheard the chairman of one of the largest companies in the region. Everett repeated himself, stating plainly that Malcolm Vance held the highest authority connected to the entire company, and the words traveled quickly back into the ballroom, where the music abruptly cut off. Board members rose from their tables and hurried into the hallway to see for themselves, while Simone stood frozen. Unable to understand why a crowd had suddenly gathered around the man she had just humiliated, Preston tried to calm her, insisting that Everett was simply protecting an old friend, but Everett ordered the entire security team to apologize to Malcolm at once. Malcolm stopped him, saying the guards had only followed the instructions they were given, and that responsibility belonged to whoever issued the order in the first place. Rochelle appeared carrying a leather case and announced that an emergency board meeting would take place immediately, right there in the ballroom. Simone demanded an explanation, and Rochelle opened a shareholder registry pointing to an entity called Vance Strategic Holdings, which owned 31% of the company outright controlled proxy votes from two major pension funds and held veto authority over any transaction above $1 billion. Simone had heard the name before, but never knew who stood behind it. Rochelle turned to Malcolm and asked when he wished to begin the meeting, addressing him as chairman, and Simone's expression collapsed entirely. Malcolm showed no satisfaction in her shock. He simply asked whether she still wanted to claim in front of everyone that she did not know him. Believing this had to be some elaborate joke. Simone looked to Everett for confirmation, and the old man explained that Malcolm had invested nearly $500 million into the company a decade earlier, at a time when every bank in the city had refused them a loan. That investment had saved thousands of jobs and allowed Everett to remain the public face of a company that in truth belonged to someone else. Simone realized the timing lined up precisely with a period years earlier when Malcolm claimed to be traveling for long consulting assignments, and one detail after another began falling into place in her memory. The quiet phone calls late at night, the unexplained trips, the subtle deference that senior executives had always shown him, without her ever questioning why. She asked why he had hidden this from her for so long, and Malcolm answered that he wanted to know whether she could love a man with no title and no fortune attached to his name. The answer to that question had just been delivered publicly, in front of everyone she was trying to impress. As the crowd absorbed the revelation, Rochelle handed a drive containing financial records to the board, evidence that Nadine had gathered, showing Preston had arranged a hidden consulting fee worth $38 million through a shell company, and Simone's signature appeared on several of the approval documents. Malcolm looked at his wife one final time before the room shifted into something far more serious than a party. "Your promotion celebration is finished," he told her. "The investigation into what you have done is beginning right now." Every guest not connected to the board was asked to leave the ballroom, and many of the same people who had laughed as Malcolm was dragged out now avoided his gaze entirely as they filed toward the exits. The tables were cleared, and the board gathered around a long conference table brought in from a nearby room with Malcolm seated at the head, a chair, Everett, personally placed in front of him, though no nameplate had ever marked that spot before. Simone remained in the same gown she had worn to accept her promotion, though the executive vice president pin had already been removed from her lapel. Outside the tall windows, the city lights of Atlanta stretched toward the horizon, indifferent to the collapse, taking place 20 floors above the street. And for a moment, Simone stared out at them, as though the view itself might offer some kind of escape from what was happening at the table behind. Here, Preston attempted to shift the blame entirely onto her, arguing that every document carried her signature and that she had personally pressured the finance team to approve the acquisition. Simone fired back that Preston had supplied the underlying data and repeatedly assured her the deal was safe. Rochelle displayed a series of internal emails on a large screen for the entire board to see. In one message, Simone instructed Nadine to stop raising concerns because a negative report might damage her chances at promotion. In another, she asked her assistant to quietly remove Malcolm from the guest list because she did not want investors learning she was married to someone with no visible standing. The room fell completely silent as the words hung on the screen, and Malcolm did not react with anger, though his stillness seemed to unsettle Simone far more than shouting ever could have. Several board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unable to look directly at either of them, while Preston studied Malcolm's calm expression and seemed to realize for the first time that this quiet man had likely already known far more than anyone at that table suspected. Nadine then presented her audit findings, revealing that Meridian Transit was concealing more than $600 million in debt, 3 pending federal lawsuits, and dozens of contracts that would never turn a profit, meaning the acquisition could have collapsed the 43ND company's stock price entirely. Preston, it turned out, had purchased put options on the company's own stock through a relative's account, meaning he stood to earn millions if the deal failed and the company suffered. Simone had received no share of that secret profit. She had only been promised a higher title in exchange for her cooperation, a bargain that now looked less like ambition rewarded and more like a woman handing over her integrity for a nameplate on a door. Preston had understood something about her that even she had refused to admit to herself, that the hunger for recognition could be pointed in almost any direction if it was fed carefully enough. Malcolm understood in that moment that Simone was both a participant in the wrongdoing and a tool, being manipulated by someone far more calculating than she realized, though being used did not erase her own responsibility. The board voted unanimously to suspend both Preston and Simone from their positions effective immediately. Preston erupted, insisting Malcolm could never prove ownership, since the shares were held through a fund. But Rochelle produced a voting agreement signed by every major shareholder, and Everett reminded him coldly that he was standing inside a building Malcolm could shut down with a single signature. Simone asked to speak with Malcolm alone, insisting their marriage should not be dragged through the same proceedings as the company's failures. But Malcolm told her plainly that she was the one who had turned their marriage into a tool for managing her professional image. She had denied him publicly before she ever knew he held any power at all, and the real issue was never that she failed to recognize his wealth. The real issue was that she believed a man without wealth did not deserve her respect in the first place. Before the meeting could continue, Rochelle received a call from federal financial investigators informing the board that Preston had just attempted to wire $12 million overseas in the middle of the meeting. The instant Preston heard the mention of the wire transfer, he stood abruptly, claimed he needed to call his lawyer, and hurried from the room. Nadine quickly discovered he had used an administrative account to begin deleting records from the company's servers, and Malcolm ordered every access point locked down and the server room sealed immediately. Curtis received instructions to detain Preston. But by then, Preston had already used Simone's access card to reach the executive elevator undetected. Simone swore she never gave him the card until Rochelle pulled security footage showing her handing it to him 3 days earlier, with Preston claiming at the time that he needed it to finalize her promotion paperwork. Malcolm asked her what else she had not admitted, and Simone was forced to confess that Preston had once asked her to install a small device on Everett's computer to copy files, and she had agreed because she believed at the time that Everett was standing in the way of her advancement. She never realized the device had been used to steal shareholder records and forge digital signatures. Everett was deeply wounded. having personally recommended Simone for her very first management position years earlier, and he now understood she had betrayed the exact person who had first given her a chance. In the underground parking structure, fluorescent lights flickering overhead and tires screeching against smooth concrete, Preston attempted to flee in a company vehicle, while Curtis and his team blocked every exit with two black sedans, angled across the ramp. He called Simone directly, threatening to release messages that would pin the entire scheme on her if she refused to help him escape. Simone faced an impossible decision in that moment, knowing that helping Preston might delay the blame falling entirely on her, but it would also mean continuing to participate in the very crime that was destroying her life. Malcolm did not push her either way. He simply told her that this choice had to reflect the person she actually wanted to become, not the title she had been chasing all along. Simone provided the remote authorization code that disabled the vehicle from a distance, and Preston's car died at the exit gate before he could reach the street. Curtis held him there until federal agents arrived, and Preston screamed that Simone would be arrested right alongside him. She answered quietly that it was possible, but she would not spend another moment being used as his instrument. It was the first genuinely honest decision Simone had made all night, though it was nowhere near enough to restore what had already been broken, and Malcolm acknowledged her choice without offering her any promise of protection. Curtis later admitted to Malcolm that in 15 years of hotel security work, he had never once watched a single evening unravel an entire company's hierarchy so completely, and he confessed he still did not fully understand how a promotion party had turned into a federal case before midnight. Everett stood near the emptied stage, staring at the wreckage of toppled chairs and abandoned centerpieces, and told Malcolm quietly that he had feared something like this might happen the moment Preston pushed so hard for the Meridian transit deal to close before year-end. Rochelle moved through the room collecting statements from board members who had witnessed the confrontation, aware that every detail would matter once regulators and reporters began asking questions of their own. When investigators opened Preston's briefcase during the search, they discovered a life insurance policy worth $25 million, written in Malcolm's name with Simone listed as the sole beneficiary. Simone stared at the document in horror, insisting she had never signed anything or requested such a policy in her life. Rochelle examined the paperwork and confirmed the signature had been copied directly from company personnel files, and the policy had been arranged through a brokerage firm quietly connected to Preston. Malcolm suddenly understood he had become a target not only because of the power he held, but because his death, under the fund's older governance agreements, would have triggered a temporary transfer of voting authority to his spouse if no successor had been named. Preston had never intended to make Simone a partner in his scheme. He intended to use her as the pathway into control of the entire company and then let all the blame fall squarely on her shoulders. Simone realized in that moment that Preston had never once treated her as an equal. He had only ever seen her as a tool to be discarded once she outlived her usefulness. The investigation shifted from corporate fraud into something far darker, a possible conspiracy against Malcolm's safety. And Curtis recalled an earlier incident where the brakes on Malcolm's sedan had failed shortly after routine maintenance at a garage under contract with the company, an incident Malcolm had dismissed at the time as simple mechanical error. Nadine traced a payment from Preston's shell company directly to that same garage, and Simone broke down completely, admitting that over many months she had casually mentioned Malcolm's schedule, his travel habits, and his driving routines to Preston, without understanding what she was actually feeding him. She never intended for anyone to hurt her husband, but her resentment had unknowingly handed Preston every tool he needed. Malcolm asked exactly what she had said about him, and she admitted that in a moment of frustration, she once told Preston how it would be easier if Malcolm simply disappeared from her life. She insisted the words had come from anger and not intention, but Preston had clearly seen an opening and used it. Malcolm could not know for certain how much of her explanation was truth and how much was fear speaking on her behalf. Simone begged him to believe she never wished for his death, and Malcolm told her that the insurance policy itself was not the most painful part of the evening. The most painful part was learning that for years she had made an outsider believe she despised the very man she had married. He remembered the night Simone failed her first management interview, sobbing in the car afterward, and telling him that if he simply believed in her, she could face anything the world put in front of her. He had driven her home that night through empty streets, letting her cry until she had nothing left, and had told her then that failure was never the end of a story, unless she decided to let it be. He had believed in her, completely sacrificed quiet years of his own recognition so she could rise without ever wondering whose shadow she stood in, and now she had stood before the entire world and denied he even existed. Malcolm instructed his attorneys to immediately amend the succession agreement, removing Simone from any voting authority connected to his personal holdings, not as an act of punishment, but as protection for the company and the thousands of the Purdick employees who depended on it. Simone understood that Malcolm had just formally declared he no longer trusted her with anything that mattered to him. Investigators soon announced that Preston had agreed to cooperate, offering evidence against Simone in exchange for a reduced sentence for himself. Preston claimed Simone had known every detail of the plan to acquire Meridian Transit from the very beginning, presenting messages in which she said she would do whatever it took to secure her promotion. Some of those messages were genuine. Others, investigators discovered, had been carefully edited, trimmed, or stitched together out of context. Nadine and a technical team recovered the original data and proved that Preston had altered timestamps and content across multiple conversations to strengthen his case against her. Even so, the authentic evidence still showed that Simone had pressured internal auditors, hidden financial warnings, granted Preston unauthorized system access, used her influence to sideline anyone who objected to the deal, and misled the board about how thoroughly the acquisition had actually been reviewed. Simone had not orchestrated the scheme, but she had committed serious violations of her duty as an executive, and Rochelle advised Malcolm to let the investigators handle the outcome without any interference from him. If Malcolm used his authority to rescue Simone, now every future decision he made would forever be questioned by the people around him. Simone told him she did not want to be saved through his money or his influence, and for the first time that night, she accepted responsibility without shifting blame onto Preston. During formal questioning, she voluntarily handed over passwords, emails, and every piece of information she possessed. Her cooperation helped investigators determine that Preston had been quietly operating 3 additional shell companies and had embezzled more than $54 million across several projects, and her honesty allowed the company to recover most of that money before it could vanish overseas. The board ultimately asked Malcolm to decide his wife's professional fate, but he declined to cast that vote himself, citing an obvious conflict of interest, and instead handed the decision to an independent committee led by Rochelle. The committee voted to strip Simone of her executive title, terminate her employment, revoke every bonus tied to the failed acquisition, permanently bar her from holding any position within the company again, and refer her file to regulators overseeing corporate conduct. Simone quietly unpinned her executive badge and set it down on the table without protest. The party meant to crown the highlight of her career instead ended with her walking out of that same room in disgrace, though this time no one had to force her out and no security guard had to touch her. Earlier that same night, Simone had ordered guards to remove Malcolm because she believed he had no place among the people in that room. By the end of the evening, she was the one forced to walk through those same doors because the power she had just received had never truly belonged to her. Before leaving the hotel, Simone handed Malcolm an envelope, and inside was a set of divorce papers she had already prepared 2 weeks earlier. Malcolm and Simone sat across from one another in the silent house the following morning, and she confessed that she had always planned to hand him those papers after the party concluded. She had believed a husband without recognition or wealth would only hold back her path toward becoming a chief executive one day. Preston had once told her that investors needed to see her as completely unburdened by her past, and she admitted she had believed him, simply because it was what she already wanted to hear. Malcolm asked if she still wanted the divorce, and Simone confessed she no longer knew whether she even had the right to ask for the marriage to continue. She tore the original papers apart in front of him, but Malcolm reminded her that the gesture could not erase what had already happened. He handed her a different set of documents, instead a formal separation agreement drafted by his own attorneys. Simone would receive no shares and no voting rights within the company, though Malcolm made no attempt to leave her with nothing at all, allowing her to keep her personal belongings and the portion of shared property recognized under the compation law. She asked why he had not taken everything from her, after everything she had done, sure that any court in the state would have sided with him after the night she had put him through. Malcolm answered that justice was never about becoming a crueler version of the person who had hurt you. He had no desire to buy her loyalty with money, and he had no desire to use money as a weapon to destroy her either. He simply wanted enough distance for both of them to finally see who they truly were without titles or performances standing between them. Simone moved out and settled into a small apartment, no longer surrounded by assistants, company vehicles, or extravagant events, and she began consulting for an organization that helps small businesses recover from financial fraud. She was given no leadership role and had to rebuild her career from the most basic assignments available. Meanwhile, Malcolm stepped forward publicly as chairman of Vance Strategic Holdings, announcing that the company was canceling the Meridian Transit acquisition entirely and redirecting $70 million in reserve funds to protect the jobs of employees who would have been affected by the deal. He also restored Nadine's position and gave her full authority to build an independent audit division from the ground up. Employees who had spent months bracing for layoffs tied to the failed acquisition instead received letters confirming their positions were secure, and several of them later told Nadine that it was the first time in years they felt like the failed people running the company actually saw them as more than numbers on a spreadsheet. Everett offered to retire immediately, but Malcolm asked him to remain for one additional year to help guide the transition. The months that followed were quiet, in a way Malcolm had almost forgotten was possible, and he found himself rebuilding a life that no longer required constant translation between who he really was and who his marriage had needed him to pretend to be. 6 months later, Simone sent Malcolm a letter, and she did not ask him to come back to her. She simply apologized for making him feel that his worth depended on how other people perceived him, admitting openly that she had loved success more than she had ever loved the man who helped her achieve it. Malcolm read the letter carefully, but did not respond right away. A year later, he received an invitation to attend the launch of a new corporate ethics program, and the person who had built that program from the ground up was Simone. The ceremony took place inside a modest conference center, a striking contrast to the extravagant ballroom where her promotion party had unfolded 12 months earlier. Simone wore no designer gown and arrived without a single assistant trailing behind her. She spoke about a program designed to help employees report misconduct without fear of retaliation, a program built directly out of the mistakes she herself had made. Simone told the room openly, and without flinching, that ambition had once made her ignore warnings, hurt people who trusted her, and betray the person closest to her heart. Her voice did not waver, as she described the exact kind of leader she never wanted anyone else to become, and several employees in the audience nodded quietly, recognizing pieces of their own workplace, fears reflected back at them, through her honesty. She never mentioned Malcolm's name, and she never used her story to ask for sympathy from anyone listening. She never mentioned Malcolm's name, and she never used her story to ask for sympathy from anyone listening, choosing instead to let the audience draw their own conclusions about the cost of chasing status without ever questioning what it required of the people around her. Malcolm stood quietly near the back of the room, having arrived, without announcing himself in advance. When her remarks ended, and she noticed him standing there, she seemed to move toward him instinctively, before catching herself choosing instead to respect the distance he had established between them. He approached her afterward and told her simply that the program she had created was genuinely good work, and she thanked him for coming. She asked whether he had forgiven her yet, and Malcolm told her that forgiveness and reconciliation were two very different things. He no longer wished to carry his anger around with him everywhere he went, but trust could only be rebuilt through years of consistent action, not a single evening of good intentions. Simone accepted his answer without pushing for anything more, and she asked for nothing beyond what he had already offered her. Malcolm reached into his jacket and withdrew the old wedding ring he had carried for an entire year without ever putting it back on. He did not hand the ring to her. Instead, he set it down on the table between them and told her that they could never return to the marriage they once had, but perhaps someday they could build something more honest in its place. Simone did not reach for the ring. She told him that this time she would not take anything she had not truly earned, and the two of them walked out of the conference center that evening in separate cars, neither one pretending the night meant more than it actually did. Outside, the evening air was cool and unremarkable, nothing like the glittering chaos of the ballroom a year earlier, and Malcolm found there was a quiet relief in that ordinariness, in walking to a plain car without a single camera or investor watching to see what he might do next. It was not a full reunion, and it was not a fairy tale ending wrapped up with a bow. It was the beginning of something slower and far more honest. A process where Simone no longer chased titles for the sake of proving her worth to strangers, and Malcolm no longer needed to hide behind an ordinary suit to discover who genuinely respected him. Preston Hale was eventually convicted on charges of fraud, embezzlement, securities manipulation, and conspiracy to endanger Malcolm's life. Sentenced to serve time in federal prison, while being ordered to return every dollar he had stolen. At his sentencing, he showed none of the charm that had once made him so persuasive in boardrooms, insisting even then that he had simply been playing the same game. Everyone around him was already playing, only better. Curtis Langston, who had tried to remain professional even while following an order he clearly regretted, was later personally thanked by Malcolm and promoted to oversee security across the entire company. Nadine Brooks became the head of an independent audit and compliance division built entirely around the lessons of that single chaotic night. Rochelle Whitaker earned a permanent seat on the board of directors, while Everett Boone retired with his reputation fully intact once the leadership transition was finally complete. Simone never regained the executive title she had once craved so desperately, but she slowly built a different kind of career, one grounded in accountability rather than appearances. Malcolm remained the quiet, publicly known chairman of Vance Strategic Holdings, still living simply, still driving an unremarkable car, never again needing to hide behind a modest suit to discover who truly respected him for the man he actually was. A year earlier, Simone had ordered security to remove Malcolm from her celebration because she believed he did not belong in her world. By the end of it all, she finally understood the truth that had been standing beside her the entire time. Malcolm had never needed her title, her company, or her approval to hold real power in his hands. He had only ever wanted the woman he loved to recognize his dignity long before she ever learned his name sat above everyone else's in that room. The chairman, calling him boss, had destroyed her promotion within seconds. But it was the quiet man beneath that title, the husband she had once denied in front of a crowd, that Simone would spend the following years learning patiently and, honestly, how to finally see. Power, it turned out, had never been the thing Malcolm was hiding from her. What he had truly been protecting all along was the simple hope that somewhere beneath the ambition and the applause, the woman he married could still recognize a good man standing quietly beside her, long before the rest of the world ever bothered to notice him at all.